to serve a huge number of people at low cost. And those tend to be the most talented people. So, and I think that actually, if you say are teachers' unions, by keeping teachers' wages up, attracting more talent into the teaching profession, I think the answer is basically no. Because what's happening is they have to compress the wages so that no one can be super successful in teaching, and thereby they keep out actually the most talented people. Yeah, what's your name?
My name is David Mao.
David Mao, okay.
I think that another purpose of doctors is to limit the supply of prescription drugs, and if we depersonalize the examination process, it's a lot easier to abuse the system and get drugs, which would be bad.
Well, I think that that's a significant issue, but I think that could probably be solved with things like exams or putting monitors on people that can tell actually better than a doctor can. And I actually don't think doctors do a particularly good job limiting the supply of prescription drugs for the same reasons that Joe was talking about. I mean, the abuse of antibiotics in this country is completely insane because doctors can just prescribe and they bear none of the social cost of overprescribing antibiotics, right? They don't pay any sort of a tax.
Not to mention the fact that if you go and look at situations like in New York, because of contracted public finance for police officers, it's frequently easier for police officers to dump someone they've arrested off at a psychiatric ward than it is for them to go and take them back and put them in a real jail.
Yeah.
And then the people there working at the psychiatric ward who don't want to deal with all of these effectively criminals who are there, they end up for their 72-hour period of analysis, throw lithium and Haldol their way and keep them in this comatose state that's serving no one, basically pushing medicine on anyone they can push medicine on. They don't have to deal with it because they don't want to be responsible.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't bear the consequences for the people of the decisions they make medically. I'm going to take a couple more questions and then we should probably go on. What's your name?
Bob.
Bob?
I know you made the comparison between librarians and Google.
Yeah.
Isn't there a more similar comparison towards easy to use web application databases like I guess WebMD or other searches and medical uses? How would you account for the fact would you expect this online database to be able to expand or?
Yeah, I mean the problem with the online database, which I think is great, is that they capture so few of the benefits associated with the what they're giving to people's health, and therefore they don't have an incentive to invest in the scale of quality because it's this information problem, right? It's like WebMD puts itself out there for free. Any information that they get, immediately spreads to the public. So there's really no way for them to make money off of having better advice for people, right? Whereas a doctor could do that. He's got all the information in his mind, basically, right? And there needs to be some way, probably through public financing, to have a much more centralized system where all the data is shared and people are doing research on that. And people can make money off of making advances in what's prescribed to people. And WebMD just isn't at the level that it can do that for people. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it really is only passing on existing knowledge. It's not really improving the quality of services that are available the way that would be possible if you could aggregate all the data that people have. Yeah?
I understand, I understand there's significant differences between projects like Wikipedia and the new online journalism, but they've still been able to finance their own things through either donations or stuff and make a significant impact.
Yeah.
Like Wikipedia replaced Encyclopedia Britannica, and newspaper journalism is falling behind. We haven't seen the same impact with this on the medical sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think that stuff is all great, but I think that medicine does require such detailed research, even compared to investigative journalism, that it's going to require a lot of resources, and there's going to have to be some way to create those resources. Plus, there's just a lot of waste because the data is not being made available for the research, which could improve, medical outcomes. I think I'm going to go on, but we'll talk more after class about this. I'm glad you guys are so interested in the issue. I think it's a really important one. Okay, so what does all that we've been talking about have to do with the class? Well, Friedman's arguments use all the sorts of tools you're going to learn in this class. So long run versus short run responses, in terms of medicine under different regimes is exactly the sort of stuff we're going to be talking about in Lecture 4 and plays a big role in his analysis. Unequal salaries that would arise under competition as opposed to the compressed salaries that arise under monopoly, we'll talk about in Lecture 5. Trying to target the solutions to problems as narrowly as possible on the problem, so not just having licensure if the problem is about information, because really that problem has to do with certification, getting the information out there rather than actually preventing people from going to the wrong doctors. So that's, we'll talk about in Lecture 7. Inferring information from people's preferences or behaviors, about people's preferences from their behaviors is another important tool. That's what Friedman was doing when he said that the fact that it's the doctors rather than the consumers lobbying for protection shows that this is probably in the doctors rather than the consumer's interest. We'll talk a lot about that in Lecture 8. In Lecture 9, we'll talk about the monopoly distortion and the incentives it creates. We'll talk about price discrimination, which he mentioned in terms of group practices in Lecture, not 10 actually, but these have been rearranged and this thing is left over. But anyways, you can check the syllabus. He talks about capture of regulators by the regulated, and we'll talk about that when we do regulation. I think that's Lecture 11 actually. He talks about the importance of in areas where information can spread freely, having some sort of a subsidy for creating that information in Lecture 13, or 14 it might be now. And that's basically the intellectual property problem. He talks about incentives of a private provider of certification of quality, and we'll talk about things related to quality and product design in some lecture that comes before 14 now. He talks about danger of too close association of producers with each other and too much communication between them. And when we talk about competition policy, how protecting consumers rather than producers is a priority when we talk about applications of competition policy. And he talks about the fact that dispersed interests have trouble getting themselves together, which is the collective action problem that we'll talk about when we do public goods. Okay. So I find all this stuff, these public policy issues, and Friedman's way of trying to analyze them from an economic perspective, very exciting, powerful, and interesting, but a natural question is whether it's science. So in what he was saying, there were no experiments, there were no real predictions, there were no hypotheses being tested, and that's what we learned science was back in middle school, right? And many people who become economists basically stop learning about the philosophy of science in middle school. So I just want to update a little bit on what it's like to be an actual scientist to think about whether this is science. So think about Darwin's theory of evolution compared to this, right? So Darwin's theory of evolution essentially has never made a falsifiable prediction, right? Because almost every story, if you think about the standard thing that's used to justify evolution, it's something like, oh, that leopard has spots because he lives in an environment where that disguises him against the predators or disguises him against the animals that it's going to be preying on, right? Which is sort of a post hoc explanation of something that we observe in the real world, and of course rests on the assumption that the environment is fixed and the environment isn't being changed more by the leopard than the leopard is changing to adapt to the environment that he's in. And evolution has essentially never been experimentally tested because it's all about explaining things that happened way, 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 way long ago, right? So nonetheless, I think everyone would say that evolution is an incredibly powerful framework for analyzing things in the natural world and for analyzing biological organization, right? And the typical analyses that you do in biology under the theory of evolution are very similar to the types of analyses Friedman was doing. So you take some fact like camouflage or lobbying, and you prescribe some action based on the theory. So like limiting antibiotics to keep viruses from adapting through evolution, or in Friedman's case, reducing licensure, right? Even the hardest theories, like in physics, like Newton's laws, really do not predict anything on their own. They're all based on, they're sort of frameworks in which, given other assumptions, you can derive predictions. So what I think this tells us is scientific theories are not really testable hypotheses about the world. They're more like languages that structure how we think about problems. And my hope is that this class will, teach you to speak the language of economics. And what is that language of economics? Well, the standard way that an evolutionary argument will go is that the environment is fixed in the following way. And given that fixed environment, organisms will adapt so as to maximize reproductive fitness. And arguments in economics are going to be very, very similar, right? They're going to say that people have some utility or preferences, which basically play the same role that reproductive fitness plays in evolutionary theory, and that the environment imposes some constraints on people. So that's what we mean by constraints, markets, and prices in economics. Like evolutionary theory, we usually assume that people's preferences don't vary too much across different people or different environments. We basically say that preferences are over basic things that people want, like love, wealth, various types of material or psychological well-being. And those we import from psychology, sociology, or biology. And then we tend to interpret all the constraints people face in terms of prices. Technology, markets, and things we get from science tell us what are the constraints that people are facing under which they optimize. So that's where a lot of the hard sciences tend to come in. So the social sciences and biology come in and telling us what people's preferences are. The hard sciences come in and telling us what technology is that people face. And then what economists try to do is figure out how those two things interact with one another when there's a large number of people. Okay. So now this isn't the only approach to thinking about social affairs. Sociologists look at things very differently, and I find it very productive to interact with them. But I hope that over the course of this course, you'll find it a useful discipline on your thinking, a fruitful language in analyzing many questions, and applicable to many areas that might not immediately seem to be economic questions. So in particular, let me run through some of the types of questions that you'll learn to analyze using economics during this course. One is, how much debt should companies take on? Another is, when does it make sense to have special tax breaks for particular groups rather than just an overall tax, something you've probably heard a lot of debate about on the campaign trail recently. A third thing is, how can prestige help correct market failures? So how can, when there's externalities, that certain things are viewed as prestigious or socially impressive, help correct that. Who should be favored in auctions? Like, imagine we have an auction and we can give a handicap to someone so they can win even if they don't beat the other person, even if they're just not too much below the other person. How could you use that to maximize revenue in an auction, to get people to actually bid more in an auction? When should you give companies, when should companies give discounts to consumers if they buy in bulk? That's something you've probably seen a lot at Costco and places like that. How progressive should a tax system be? How generous should unemployment benefits be? What is the right mix of subsidies for research and development and